If you have any issues accessing any of this, please drop a message in the chat. And then maybe Ernesto or someone else from the Access team can support you in being able to, get the information or get the audio that you need. So I see a few folks are still joining. So I'm glad that folks are having a chance to get together with us this evening. Once again, as folks are joining, maybe they didn't hear the intro, my name is Danny, and I'm a field organizer with Media Justice. I organize in collaboration with many of our partners on the Unshackling Freedom Project, which is a project looking to support groups on the ground who are already leading amazing work and organizing against the harms of electronic monitoring, incarceration, which is part of a larger system, of course, of surveillance and incarceration of our people. And we are also excited to support groups who are looking at starting campaigns against this system, right? And this is part of what this learning series is about, sharing information based on what folks across the country and different communities have told us is needed, is coming up as a challenge. And a big thing that we've heard a lot is narrative, right? That there are constant attacks through propaganda. There are constant attacks around trying to expand, right, these systems of surveillance, incarceration, and often the language that is used against our people can be tricky to navigate, right? And so we recognize that, and we want to be able to support y'all and everybody in our communities in developing messaging that is abolitionist and that is holding true to our values of full collective liberation. Quick reminder, just a couple of agreements. If you have sound in your background, right, make sure to keep yourselves on mute. But then as well, we will have some time for engagement, right? So there will be opportunities for you to come off mute for some questions. Also, if you do have questions throughout the program, you can also drop them in the chat. And then otherwise, please just, again, keep us posted if there's something that would be helpful. This is a quick overview of the agenda. We're going to start with the discussion with the homie Ambrose from DPN Justice LA in a bit. We'll have a quick break following that. And then we're going to do a couple of activities, one from the Propaganda Clapback Toolkit that another fellow organizer with MJ Rumsha, MJ being Media Justice, excuse me for the acronyms. Rumsha will share that activity with us. And then we'll hear from DJ Hudson, also with Media Justice, about messaging recommendations and resources. And I'm sure folks are really going to appreciate a lot of this conversation and the tools. I know every time I review them, I really appreciate them. And I think there's a lot of really good stuff that we're going to get into this evening. So without further ado, let's go into this next section then, which will be discussion that we're calling Freedom is the Alternative, the Importance of Abolitionist Messaging. So who's excited about this? Give me some reactions, give me some love, give me something in the chat. Who's down to learn about the importance of abolitionist messaging? Cool, I see some excitement out here. Awesome. So now I think I have my screen shared, so I'm gonna stop that now, and then we'll pin Ambrose and me for a discussion. And I have my questions here. I hope you're ready, Ambrose. Rapid fire coming your way. Just kidding. So if you want to introduce yourself briefly, first off, your name, your org, where you're joining us from, and then I'll kick us off with questions.
Sure thing. Thank you so much, Danny, and the Media Justice team and the Unshackling Freedom Squad. My name is Ambrose. I use they, them, and their pronouns. I am the campaign and advocacy manager at Dignity and Power Now. We're a grassroots organization in Los Angeles, and I help coordinate the Justice LA Coalition, a big abolitionist coalition based in Los Angeles, where our main project is reducing the footprint of incarceration and really committed to closing down Men's Central Jail, which is the largest jail in Los Angeles and one of the largest jails in the country. And I'm here to talk about, how also, we're fighting against the use of electronic monitoring and how that is inextricably linked with our fight to close down Men's Central Jail. And, thanks so much, Danny, for having me.
Of course. So as you mentioned, right, the scope of y'all's work is a range. And I know that there have been various efforts by LA County officials to expand electronic monitoring. So can you share a recent example about this that y'all have dealt with? And who was pushing for it? Who was against? Just kind of lay out the scenario for us.
Sure. If you're cool with it, I'm going to bring up two examples. The first one, first off, it's a repeated position from LA County, from the Board of Supervisors, which is LA County's municipal government, and the probation department, the sheriff's department, people who are speaking on behalf of the judiciary in Los Angeles. It's a repeated position that, if you activists want to close down this jail, we'll help you do that if and only if we can put people on electronic monitors. And so, a refrain we hear quite often is, we'll give you what you want, activists, but we're going to put people on monitors. And we're there to push back and say that's actually not a solution. And one really specific example actually came in the youth context. LA County has a probation oversight commission who is responsible for overseeing the probation department. How effective is that? Not very effective. But there was a probation oversight commission meeting a couple months ago where we had been working with some commissioners as well as UCLA Criminal Justice Program to come up with a motion that the Probation Oversight Commission could introduce that would require the probation department to report a lot of data related to its use of electronic monitoring, both on adults and young people who have been put on monitors in Los Angeles, asking really basic questions like, what are the most frequent violations, for people who are put on a monitor? How many people are on a monitor? These questions that should be answered with public records requests. And when we do those public records requests, we are, continued almost a year from actually receiving any information. It's, we can't give you this information. This is not the way that we collect information, the back and forth with the county department that I'm sure many of you go through when you're trying to do these PRAs. So we thought, all right, the Probation Oversight Commission can issue a motion that will require the probation department to give the commission data. And so related to the use of EM, this data is really hard to get. The probation officers brought in people currently on probation and on electronic monitoring to advocate for more electronic monitoring. So imagine the pressure of the situation where your probation officer is most likely giving you no choice but to come to this county meeting to talk about why you think more people should be on a monitor. And, especially for young people. And the commissioners themselves, after hearing some of this, these public comments where it's a person with their probation officer standing right next to them, the commissioners themselves described electronic monitoring as an effective way to, quote, get young people out of jail. But other commissioners, those with lived experience themselves and family members on monitors, discussed how the commission should not think of electronic monitoring as an alternative to incarceration, but as another form of incarceration. So this is one really specific example of just how in a small county commission meeting, this both narrative and like policy choices are reflecting how LA County, those who have some power over the entities that are putting people on monitors or are responsible for supervising people on monitors, are really interested in expanding monitors. So much so that they're bringing in, the people they're overseeing to start advocating for the expansion of electronic monitoring. So that's the first example. Danny, do you want me to pause before I give the second example?
Go for it.
So, another proposed expansion that happened recently coincided with Los Angeles County instituting a new bail schedule. So in Los Angeles County, the LA Superior Court sets what's called a bail schedule. And the period before you see a judge is called the pre-arraignment period. And LA County's new bail schedule lets some people, be cited and released or booked and released prior to arraignment. It eliminates cash bail for many different charges. And one additional option under this new bail schedule is that a judge can review a file and say, okay, book and release, cite and release, or we're going to actually detain someone until arraignment. There's a lot of problems with this new bail schedule, I'll say that. But reducing the amount of people who are, held in on bail before arraignment is really an effective way to reduce pretrial detention, which is something that our coalition is really concerned about. But one proposal from LA County entities like the sheriff's department, even the board of supervisors, was that judges who review somebody's file would have the option to put somebody on electronic monitoring even before they're arraigned. So even before this person sees a judge, it's just like a judge in some dark room, not even seeing somebody in the face saying, okay, we'll put this person on a monitor before they're arraigned. And this is a moment actually where there's a moment where we step outside of abolitionist messaging, because in order to strike that down, we actually had to briefly recognize a legitimacy in the court system. And we had to do this because we had to say, oh, what? Somebody who prior to arraignment should also be afforded due process. If a judge is making a decision that will, restrict their freedom and put somebody under carceral surveillance, when a person not only doesn't get to see the judge, but also has no representation, that raises some due process concerns. And as abolitionists, we're like, the court system is entirely illegitimate. We don't want to give any recognition to judges, et cetera. But this was a moment where we had to say, all right, let's step back from purely abolitionist messaging to say, no, this due process concern is actually, so significant that you should take electronic monitoring off the table for any sort of condition of pre-arraignment release. And they did. And so I thought that that was an effective moment of compromise where we could have said, we're not going to engage in this language at all. But we said, okay, we are going to give some legitimacy to you judges, some legitimacy to the court system. And this is a due process concern that, should absolutely eliminate, you putting people on monitors as a condition of pre-arraignment release. So we ended up actually halting that, potential expansion of electronic monitoring in the pre-arraignment period for people in LA.
So thank you so much for sharing. I feel like that's a couple of really great examples that I show a lot of the nuance, right, that comes up in this challenges around narrative and messaging. And I also just want to read out loud a message in the chat. Kat is noting this is all about corporate profiteering. We have heard that smaller electronic monitoring companies are being taken over by corporate prison profiteers. And Ambrose is right on, speaking the truth for sure. And that's actually a great preview, foreshadowing, whatever the right word is, for our December workshop, where we are going to be digging into the role of private companies and how they collude with public officials to expand incarceration. So you mentioned some of this already, Ambrose, but I'd like to hear what did you feel was most effective in countering these challenges, right? And who do you think were what was the impact of abolitionist framing? Who were the best messengers for that?
For sure. Thanks, Danny. And I spoke a little bit about, the messaging challenges related to the pre-arraignment electronic monitoring situation. But going back to the Probation Oversight Commission, one messaging challenge we were faced with is, we're faced with people who are currently on electronic monitoring, advocating for electronic monitoring. And I want to say that, of course, in the work that we do, I've spoken with people who have described what they see as a benefit to electronic monitoring. Someone I was speaking with actually really found comfort and support in the frequent check-ins that they were required to do as part of a monitor. But what we ended up having a conversation about actually was that this doesn't show that electronic monitoring works. What it actually shows is a lack of support for those going through the criminal legal system. Such a lack of support that somebody feels the most supported when they're under constant surveillance, when a probation officer is checking in with them, because there are not other structures to, because of the lack of investment in community, resources, that this person is actually finding the most supportive system being their probation officer, forced to check in with them about electronic monitors. And so that's obviously really, upsetting to hear. It's like, oh, wow, you're bought into this because this is the one support that you've been offered. So I think one effective alternative messaging strategy is to really speak with people to imagine, what a life would be like without a monitor. And also to have people, share their stories and talk with folks, people who have been on electronic monitoring, who, have really come to terms with how damaging it was, for their livelihoods. I, have permission to speak about one of my colleagues who was on an electronic monitor, and he shares his experience quite often about being on electronic monitor while he was bedridden from injuries from a near fatal car accident. And what this demonstrated is that often people in Los Angeles are put on monitors just because a judge feels comfortable doing so, not because there's actually any legitimate risk of them leaving the county. In my colleague's case, he couldn't even get out of bed, let alone leave the jurisdiction, but they still put him on a monitor. And so I think that in two ways of countering, or two ways of responding to people who've been on monitors who say this is what I want, this is what's working, is talking about actually, what would actually work. Does somebody need housing? Does someone need, guaranteed basic income? Does somebody need mental health care? Does someone need health care? One of these folks that I was talking to relied on their, this independent contractor from Corrective Solutions, relied on those check-ins as like a mental health check-in. And it's because there was nobody else there to be able to do that for him. And so I think it's also activating folks around, we can change those circumstances if we work together. So you're not relying on the Corrective Solutions guy as the person you're, talking to frequently.
Yeah, and I keep thinking about that, like how trippy it is that, EM, electronic monitoring, comes with so much tracking, limitation of movement, curfews, etc. But when it comes to making people go and testify in favor of expanding it, the parole officers are making that accessible, one more, I think we have time for one more question, because in case anybody has anything in the chat. But following up on what you're saying as well, right? A little bit about, like, what would you say how the state and our targets, right, undermine and even co-opt, right, sometimes some of this messaging? I know you mentioned some of, like, when it comes from people who are, for example, directly affected by it, that provides some challenges. But you also mentioned, right, even like people in office sometimes also take advantage of these situations. So wondering what you have thoughts on that.
Sure. I think that in LA County, the people who are tasked, and well, one thing in the question that I think you and I had discussed is like this quote, alternatives to incarceration, alternatives to detention framework that like some organizers work with, and then actually many county entities in LA co-opt that framework or co-opt that language, where in LA County, the county departments and officials who are tasked with quote, like implementing these alternatives to incarceration actually don't think expansively at all about like about alternatives, about incarceration, and they just rely on an incarceration by a different name and a different look. For example, electronic monitoring. To the people who are tasked with implementing quote alternatives to incarceration in Los Angeles, they consider electronic monitoring an alternative. And we know that that's not the case. And I think one really important thing for us as like organizers and strategists to think about is, what if we got rid of quote, the alternatives to incarceration framework entirely. I mean, the language, what if we got rid of that language altogether? Because we need to ask ourselves, how is this phrase and how is this language potentially reproducing the state conditions we're trying to dismantle? When we say alternatives, is that radical enough, actually? Because what do people think about when you think alternatives to incarceration? They potentially aren't thinking as expansively as, oh no, we're here to dismantle the entire carceral state, which is abolitionist, and that's an abolitionist coalition. That's what we're grounded in. And so some people think an alternative is an alternative to a brick and mortar jail, for example, electronic monitoring. And to us, we say, okay, maybe we need to go beyond the language of alternatives to incarceration, actually think more broadly and radically about the language we're using.
Thank you so much, Ambrose. This and your previous comments are also reminded me of the current situation where 3,000 people were released during the height of the pandemic under the CARES Act from Bureau of Prison Facilities. They were all put on monitoring, right? Which of course we're also against that. But like a note that kind of what you were saying, when people are able to access the support that they need, right? And being with their communities, homes, etc., where the quote unquote like recidivism rate in that situation is 0.19%, 0.19, not even half percent, but it is because people have access to what they need, right? And so how can we continue to build up that support as well, and reframing it and reclaiming again, like what we're doing today, the narrative to what it's supposed to be. We have one quick question from Laura. Do you think that it is an effective narrative intervention in the case you stated if we point out that those directly impacted folks can't voluntarily consent to tell their truth, now when their probation officer is standing next to them, now when their alternative to EM is a brick and mortar jail?
I mean, absolutely. I think that, I was there at this meeting just as a presenter, so I actually didn't even have authority to respond to people's public comments. But thankfully, there were commissioners on the panel who, had been through the probation department themselves, are formerly incarcerated, who have experienced the, essentially almost like duress from the probation department. And they were able to speak out and say, we of course appreciate your public comment, but then speaking to the probation officer standing next to them, like, what were the conditions that led to, this person giving a public comment? And how, like, is there a way where we can actually speak with them outside of the presence of a probation officer? But I think that it's important to bring this up more publicly, because this was in a closed county commission meeting that maybe 10 people were watching on Zoom. And so I think it is definitely important to raise awareness that this is something that is happening in LA County's probation department.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ambrose. And I'm also going to read out loud a comment from Kat in the chat. One more thing is the cost in Hawaii. Most of the folks on monitors cannot afford $60 a month on top of all their other court costs and living expenses, family responsibilities, etc. For sure. And definitely agree. Like, that's the other parts of how we are able to also build up positive narratives, right? And calling out all of the harms of EM, including all of that, the cost and the day-to-day impacts. So I believe that's it for our time. Ambrose, thank you so much for this discussion. If folks have any follow-up questions, I wonder if you'd be cool with dropping your email in the chat. DPN and Justice LA have been key presenters in past workshops, including last month when we did one around supporting folks who are directly impacted with wellness practices. And so later on, we'll share a resource guide that includes a lot of their materials. So thank you, Ambrose. And if folks can share some love, reactions in the chat, emojis, etc., that would be awesome to show some appreciation. And we're going to now take a very quick break just as we transition into our next section. So we're going to do just a couple of minutes and then we'll be back at 706-406, depending where you are. Cool. Thank you. Okay, friends, I hope folks were able to get in a quick stretch, maybe do a little breathing after listening to all the sometimes stressful stuff we gotta navigate in our communities. But at the same time, I also hope folks were able to identify a lot of great examples of what we can, apply in our local communities, and also like I think there's a lot of hope in seeing wins like the ones that are being like the ones that are happening in LA, right? And I'm sure in other places. And so I am now going to direct us to our next section in the agenda, which will be led by Ramsha, who's going to be going over some resources in the Propaganda Clapback Toolkit, which I'll let you share a little bit more context about that. And then from there, we'll transition over to DJ Hudson, who's going to share some messaging recommendations with us. So I'll pass it over to you, Ramsha.
Hey folks, my name is Ramsha Sajid. I am a field organizer here with Media Justice. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak. Kudos to Danny on this entire learning series and organizing it. It has been just such a joy to watch you do this work and to be a part of it, so thank you. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about our propaganda work. So in May of 2023, Media Justice released a resource and toolkit called Propaganda Clapback that we created in collaboration with our grassroots network members and researchers at the Tech and Social Change Project. And so together we created this resource because we saw in our communities the ways that police spread false information or disinformation, and often police sympathizers will spread false information and disinformation to quell our own organizing efforts. And so that's a little background on how this project came about, and we'll drop in the chat a link to the entire resource. But today, I'm just going to share a small snippet with y'all about the work that we've been doing, training over 500 journalists and grassroots activists on how to fight back against propaganda. So why did we decide to focus on propaganda? we see in our grassroots organizing work just the different ways that we are confronted with having to debunk really big misconceptions about crime and safety, right? So when you check the local news, or when you look at apps like Nextdoor or Citizen, often you see really big misconceptions about safety and crime because they have such deep emotional effects on us and our own understandings of safety and comfort in our communities. And those narratives exist for a reason. So police departments have dedicated marketing budgets and offices of communication where they push to influence local media in your communities. And that propaganda is so influential, and those narratives are so influential because they have power to shape public opinion, especially at key inflection points politically across our communities, and they influence public policy. So my hope is that in this presentation, a key takeaway is that narrative is not just an intellectual exercise. Like, narrative is not just us talking about stories people say about us. It is important and can be used for action and material change, right? Because at the end of the day, politicians or police sympathizers or police themselves will use narrative to justify their violence against our communities. And so this is a space for us to reclaim that and reclaim our efforts in fighting back against policing and surveillance like electronic monitoring. So I'm going to go over two narrative examples. And in our work at Media Justice, we really try to focus on narrative as both action and narrative. So, for example, a city budget release. Those happen annually or biannually, depending on where you live, where you'll see a lot of news about crime in your communities, right? And those correlate a lot with city budget releases. So whenever there's a politician describing their plan for how we should use our public tax dollars, often it'll be paired with news cycles that say there's too much crime and that crime rates are going up. And that is used to justify police budgets. And so the action behind that would be to buy more police equipment and to include more high-tech surveillance tools and further disinvest from things that we know do keep us safe, like public health services or housing or education. A second example would be waves of immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers in our communities. And the narratives we see around that is that often people say we need to secure our borders, or that asylum seekers are criminals, or they assign criminality to people who are a recent arrivants into this country. And the action behind that is often more funding for borders, more immigrant detention, and more separation of families and surveillance. So why focus on narrative interventions, right? A big part of that is that we want to understand the narratives that people in power use to justify this violence so that we can fight back. And we can respond with our own counter narratives, and we can invite more people to join our movements, right? We can educate people on, actually, it's not your individual fault that we've experienced systemic violence, right? Like, these are not individual failings. These are tied to larger structures and systems. And we can also fight back because we'll get sharper in our analysis and we'll remain rooted in our values and our demands as we fight back with a counter narrative. And so right now, I'm going to give you a snippet.
Please slow down a bit.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Just slow down.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you. So now we're going to do a small exercise from the curriculum itself, the Propaganda Clapback curriculum. And so I'm going to switch screens real quick. And in the chat, we'll have the Jamboard shared as well that we're all going to be working on. So it should be in the chat, and then I'll pull it up here. Okay, can folks see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So we're going to talk a little bit about talking points that supporters of electronic monitoring use. And then I'm going to give y'all 10 minutes to sort of fill out this Jamboard around who is spreading propaganda about electronic monitoring, how does it get spread, and why do false narratives of electronic monitoring get spread? And so I'm going to give folks 10 minutes to add their sticky note to this Jamboard. If you're not familiar with Jamboard, you can see this like left side of small icons on your screen, and you click the sticky note option and you can type something in. So for example, a talking point that supporters of EM use is that EM is better than incarceration. So I will add that to the Jamboard, and you can also move around your sticky note. So please start populating the Jamboard with your own ideas around talking points that supporters use, and answering the rest of the questions on the slide. And we'll take about like 5 to 7 minutes. So at the 22-minute mark, we'll come back and we'll read through it together.
Awesome. And I will play some music.
Hey folks, thank you so much for populating the Jamboard today. We have such amazing things people have added. And so I'm going to read a couple pieces that I noticed here. Like, for example, people mentioned a lot that EM is connected to innovation and technology, that it keeps people safer, especially people who are survivors of intimate partner violence, that it helps monitor serious offenders, that it's cheaper than someone staying in an individual county jail. These are all really, really important points, I think, especially as we turn to who is spreading some of this propaganda. So we're seeing police unions, law enforcement agencies, big tech, sometimes legislators. These are all really great. And I appreciate whoever added this resource around profiteers and different corporations. I encourage people to click through that. And in terms of how it gets spread, I see like scare tactics, local news channels, correctional facilities, cop press releases. These are really great, especially as we think about the next part of our presentation with DJ. I think these are going to be really helpful to sort of prep our thinking. So thank you so much. And thank you to our interpreters for your patience. I get very excited when I get to talk about things. So thank you. And I will pass it now to DJ, who is an amazing co-organizer with us here at Media Justice. You'll be in amazing hands with him. Thank you so much, y'all.
Hey, how's it going? I am going to share my screen, one of many, so bear with me a moment. Oh. There we are. So howdy, good evening. My name is DJ Hudson. I am Media Justice's digital organizer, and I won't take too much of your time this evening. Mostly go over some kind of best practices that we use and things that we keep in mind in the ways that we talk about EM and the ways that we talk about the impact of incarceration on our folks, but also in the ways that we handle data when it comes to these narratives. So first, I'll start on the left of my slide. This is actually a quote from a recent article in Prison Legal News. James Kilgore, comrade of ours, and Brian Dolinar published recently. Quote reads, "Electronic monitoring is not an alternative, not a diversion, not a new way of doing things. Electronic monitoring and the usual regimes of house arrest that accompany tracking technology are another form of incarceration. Proponents may package EM as reform, but its essence remains punishment and control." So today I'm gonna talk a little bit about how to answer what sounds like a common sense question, but isn't EM better than jail? And also one I'm sure many people on this call have heard in one form or other quite often. So how to respond to this question? For one, as Ramsha just said, we definitely are going to be referring back to those Jamboard post-its because you all clocked a lot already. And also, as we saw and heard with what Ambrose was sharing from people's lived experiences and their stories, that the truth of what a person experiences is actually the most important data that you need. I think sometimes I definitely have a background in local organizing. When you were dealing with a police chief like we did in Nashville back up until about 2018 or so, when your police chief was the former head of public relations in your city, you got your hands full when it comes to messaging. But that does not mean that you have to memorize and spew a bunch of facts and figures, not because those aren't important, but because what counts as data is actually much more expansive. And I think that it is also its own form of resistance and reclaiming our narratives. When we talk about EM and media justice, we emphasize the fact that EM is not an alternative to incarceration, as we've heard many times tonight, that it's another form of incarceration. But we also talk about the impact of EM as one of the most obvious ways that you can see right through the fallacy of EM as a simple, benign alternative, much less the assumption a lot of people make that technology automatically makes something better, cheaper, easier. All we have to do is actually just look to our people in our own lives and families and communities and experiences, and we've got all the data that we need to unpack these lies. One of the things we know, both from the data as well as from our lived experiences, is that EM extends the reach and the harm of the prison system into our homes, our families, and our communities. It's a false solution, and it creates uniquely harmful conditions. On the left is a screenshot of the cover of a report that we released some years ago, the No More Shackles report, 10 arguments against pretrial electronic monitoring. And we've made sure that there are links to this and several other pieces that we've written so that you can literally use the language that someone else has already used before, because a lot of these reports, the majority of what they contain are people's stories. Some of the talking points that we want to reiterate to always say and share: you don't have to get into a back and forth argument with somebody about whether or not EM lowers prices or how, it might help get folks out quicker. One thing you can say is what is true is that EM is not an alternative to the prison system. It is an alternate form of incarceration. Also, saying again and being clear that EM extends the reach and the harm of the prison system into our homes, our families, and our communities. I actually noticed that one of the posted notes that someone dropped for reasons why people might support EM or believe that it is a positive or helpful alternative. It's really chilling when you think that some people believe that EM is a better alternative because it allows people to be closer to their communities and to stay in their homes and their communities. And when you understand that EM is also a means of surveillance, that means that actually what it seemed like a benefit is only beneficial to someone who will profit or benefit from being able to surveil as many people as possible beyond the individual who's actually on a device or having to report through an app. So the very same things that someone says is a reason why EM is better can easily just be flipped when you just listen to people's lived experiences. Again, we highly recommend letting our folks' stories lead the way. When you visit the hotspots, the electronic monitoring hotspots map, one of the resources that we are also going to share with you all that you have access to through our website at any time. You'll see when you look there, we've got reports, we've got legislation, we have news articles, and every single place possible, we also have our people's stories. We have video, we have interviews, we have audio. But why? Because our real lived experiences are data, and we deserve, and our movements deserve, and the people whose hearts and minds we are trying to change deserve to understand that you don't have to listen to a quote unquote expert. You can listen to the people in your own neighborhood to understand this issue. I want to just pause and check for time. How are we doing? It's a little transparent facilitation. We're good. Cool. Rocking steady. I'll read some of what I've got here on the right of my slide. It says recommendations. Harnessing our stories are powerful. Storytelling centers those who are living with EM and tells the truth about the impact of this carceral technology in our homes, neighborhoods, and communities. Stories connect fights across the country, and they shift hearts and minds towards abolition. It is so important and significant that our people see one another showing up in the streets right now for Palestine, showing up in the streets to stop Cop City, showing up in the streets every single where we go. And the same is true for those of us who are doing decarceration work. When we tell our stories, it makes it easier for somebody else who is in a struggle, who might not know that they're not alone, just to hear and see one another. Real lived experiences also reframe the issue. One of the simplest ways to break electronic monitoring myths and misinfo is to allow people's stories to just speak for themselves. Again, stories are data. The word data just means information. Technology seems to have this mysterious hold sometimes. And All you have to do is just let real live human beings tell a story of how technology impacts their lives for you to reach folks at where it impacts your life. And you start thinking, perhaps this thing might not just be cheaper, easier, and smoother. Maybe actually I have some dissonance too to work through with this thing. Oh, excuse me, I did not read. This on the left, we've got a screenshot and a photograph of a video interview we have with Miss Monica Cosby, and a quote from her that says, "Whatever place you are in becomes like a satellite jail." Cosby spent time on a monitor in a halfway house after 20 years in Illinois prisons. That's one sentence. You could write a paragraph, you could write an op-ed if you wanted to, if that's not your experience, or you can go find Ms. Monica's in your community who can sum up the issue right there. Whatever place you are in becomes like a satellite jail. Again, a little bit more about reframing the issue. Some of this we've said before, so I'll try to slide over it a little bit. But we reframe the issue by including the realities that are left out by misinformation. One of the ways that misinformation sneaks in is by conveniently omitting details, like the fact that people who are being asked and invited to testify while on an ankle monitor are having to do so next to their PO. These are things that are quite obvious, and all your job is to do is to point it out by telling the truth. Calling in what it is, incarceration and surveillance. There's no need to tiptoe about it. If you know what it is, if we know better, we do better. We tell the truth. When we consistently use intentional language like incarceration, you are reminding people that EM is not a humane reform or a harmless piece of jewelry. It is a carceral tool. There are places and times for specific and clear language, and this is absolutely one of them. And then also you make the invisible visible. Since EM is an extension of incarceration into people's homes, sometimes storytelling is a powerful way to show people the impact of living with the prison industrial complex in your home when you might not see it otherwise. Another beautiful, genius way that our people are already sharing this data, social media. TikTok, our folks will tell their stories if we let them. And when movement meets people at the stories they're already telling, then we can work together. And the links on this particular slide, which y'all will be able to access, are from one of my favorite places on the internet, the Beautiful Trouble Toolbox for Revolution. You can click through. There's so many different short and easy pieces of information and resources about a lot of things, but definitely about strategic messaging. And lastly, yeah, these are some recommended resources. All of these have been added to the resource list that we'll share with you all, but you'll be able to click through these slides as well. I believe you'll have access. Y'all please correct me if I'm wrong on that. But some of them, just to read them off, on the left, we've got a list of different EM reports and messaging examples that have come from us, Media Justice, over time. The No More Shackles report, 10 arguments against pretrial electronic monitoring that I was talking about earlier. The Cages Without Bars report, Mapping Pretrial Risk website. The No More Shackles parole report. The Electronic Monitoring Hotspots map, my personal favorite, but they're all dope. Also the hotspot map, you'll find a lot of different pieces of information. Many of the places are going to be specific to where you live. And so you might want to check it out, click around on the states and the cities and see if you can get close to the movement where you are, or learn about another place you didn't know about yet, but you might want to make a connection. And then on the other side, we've got even more narrative strategy guides and reports that inspire and support our work. Beautiful Trouble, which I gave a shout out to. The Values Problem Solution and Action Toolkit, from Opportunity Agenda, Obscuring the Truth, How Misinformation is Skewing the Conversation About Pretrial Justice Reforms in Illinois, from the Illinois Network for Pretrial Justice. And then Reframe, I've got some links here to the Narrative Power Map and their Narrative Power Layer Cake worksheets. I love a good worksheet. Do with it as you will, but also highly encourage you to explore all of these different websites to learn more about these organizations and other resources they can provide. And with that, it's time for questions. I can stop bumping my gums and hear from y'all about anything you'd like to hear more about. And again, appreciate y'all for joining us.
I see some applause happening. Yeah, definitely applause. Um, do folks have questions, whether it's about the materials, resources that were shared, or there might also be things going on locally in your work, right, that you might want some feedback about? I feel like Ambrose, you're still here, right? So if you also have questions for Ambrose, for DJ, for Ramsha, for sure, either come off mute or drop it in the chat. And then I'm also seeing in the chatted question, will we get these sent to us after the call? Yes. I dropped all the links in the chat, but I will also be following up by email with all the resource guide and recording of today's workshop. So I see one question from Wanda. Do you have tips or guidance on talking about the profiteering or industry aspect of electronic monitoring? So yeah, I'll open it up to whoever from folks who spoke today. Ambrose, you cool if I spotlight you as well? Just in case you want to jump in.
Sure. What I was going to say is that actually I feel like this is a big area for growth for at least our coalition. Is, you know, figuring out how to factor in the large, Securus Technologies actors as part of our conversation. When LA is in a position where, already the county has eliminated the fines and fees associated with electronic monitoring. So now an individual, I mean, aside from having to pay for, energy, internet in order to maintain the monitor, they're not having to pay, the hookup fee or monthly costs associated with that. And that often is an avenue for bringing in the profiteering narrative. And so I would love for anyone to we open the floor to anyone who wants to speak about how to bring this angle more into the conversation in a way that you specified, Wanda, where you talk about it in a way that actually does not, diminish or distract from the real harms people are facing on the ground.
Can I chime in for a second?
Yep.
Okay, hey. I guess one thing to put out there, and I wonder what you guys would think of this, is I work at Prison Policy Initiative, and we've done some work before around the prison phone industry, which is the companies in that industry, including Securus, sorry for the speed, are trying to take over the market, right? Like aiming for market dominance and being in a basically being an economy of scale is a big part of how those companies operate and their strategy. So when we talk about, like when I'm talking to reporters and I talk about Securus, one of the things I say is, or can say is, this is not just your county jail. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry that's looking for opportunities, like all industries, for exposure. So I promised my question was not catfishing, so I could say my piece, but I wonder if that's potentially a way into talking about this, even in places where the fees have been eliminated.
Yeah. One of the ways that I like to talk about some of like following the money and why we should follow the money, particularly when people's eyes start to glaze over when you start listing enough numbers and different corporate names that they don't know, is to try to tie the financial incentive, one, to the fact that like this is how we can know that they're not going to stop. They don't have a reason to stop price gouging. They don't have a reason to stop sending lobbyists. They don't have a reason to keep trying to thumb the scale, because they have a financial incentive in a land that encourages hypercapitalism. And then I think another reason is like if there is context, especially if it's local organizing or a local place like you named, you know, it might not be just your local city jail. This is a massive corporation. People have a lot of questions about big tech right now. And those are questions that definitely we at Media Justice are always trying to encourage. And so I think that is particularly if you're talking about an area that's being gentrified by Amazon, building servers, or by tech companies coming in and pushing people out, it is absolutely worth it to raise the question of how many more technology companies are we going to let profit off of the disappearance of our people?
I see, Morgan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, to Wanda's question, Morgan Duckett from Worth Rises, chief part of our mission is dismantling the prison industry. So we're very much focused on that. And we're really starting to dig in on developing work around electronic monitoring as an industry. One thing that we are really focused in on and think would be helpful messaging around corporate involvement here is that the biggest players in electronic monitoring are the boogeymen of prison operators, right? So it's Geo Group, who has already garnered so much hatred, and hatred's a strong word, right? But the banks, investors have for a few years now refused to do business with private prisons. But it's the same people that own and operate private prisons that are now diversifying into electronic monitoring. And Dana, who's here with me, is my director, speaks on this as well. But it's basically they're trying to solve a problem that they created in many ways, right? So for so long they have been lobbying, creating the propaganda, as was listed in that Jamboard, to drive incarceration, detention, and now they're just diversifying into electronic monitoring. And if we can make that connection in the popular narrative that this is the same, these are the same actors, and the same treatment that you put towards private prisons and divestment towards private prisons should apply to electronic monitoring and e-carceration.
Thank you, folks, for your questions. I'm seeing some reactions as well. Does anybody else have additional questions they'd like to share? Okay, well, thank you so much. And I think that this discussion sort of connects us very clearly to the next workshop, right? Where we'll be talking about the way that private companies and public officials are colluding, right, to expand e-carceration, which we know that's, you know, these companies, of course, are profiteering, but they're getting the money from our public funds, right? And as folks are mentioning in the chat, that includes companies' contributions to politicians and that whole horrible cycle that we know exists between politicians that are actively implementing agenda that are criminalizing, surveilling, incarcerating, and harming our peoples and communities, right? And the way that these companies are making money off of it. And so December's workshop will be a conversation about that. We know that this is about self-determination in so many ways, right? From being free from cages and incarceration, but really about the self-determination of our well-being, including that our resources are shared, are ours, right? And are for liberation. So I want to thank all of our presenters today who shared such a great workshop. Ambrose, DJ, Rumsha, and all of you who joined us. I want to thank the Axis team members as well, who make this space as accessible as we can, right? This is of course recorded, so we'll be sharing it out, including resource guide and different ways that you can keep up with what we have coming up in this project. And then I'm also just going to drop in the chat the link for December's workshop, so you can check out the description here and also the bit.ly for folks to sign up. I'll make sure to send folks a follow-up email, and if you can help us get the word out for December's workshop, that would be really great. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up, Danny@mediajustice.org. And it's so great to see lots of you that we've connected and reconnected in this space, and definitely looking forward to building more together. So thank you all so much. Have a good one.